The tray was still in my hands when he walked through the door. I heard the conversation drop not all at once, but in a wave table by table, the way sound dies before a storm. Someone's fork hit porcelain. A chair scraped back. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't need to. Then his voice. Low. Certain. The kind of voice that had called order in rooms a lot louder than this one. Ironclad. Not a question. Not surprise. Just recognition. The way you'd name something you never expected to see treated as ordinary. I turned, and the look on his face wasn't shock. Not quite. It was something older than that. Something that looked almost exactly like fury held very still. Before we begin, drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. I always want to know who's out there listening. Now let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I had been sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment, a rental still half unpacked after 3 months' boxes stacked against the wall like I hadn't quite committed to being back yet, and I was holding the invitation like it was a piece of evidence. Cream cardstock? Richard and Diane Russell request the pleasure of your company. My father's name first, then hers. That was new. Or maybe it wasn't new anymore and I just stopped noticing. I was 42 years old. I had prosecuted war crimes in 3 countries. I had stood in rooms where the air itself felt classified, where the wrong word could end a career or start an incident. I had done all of that. And I was sitting in a half-unpacked apartment in Virginia, trying to talk myself into attending a dinner party at my childhood home. That's the thing nobody tells you about coming back. It isn't the jet lag or the silence or the way American grocery stores feel too bright and too large after years of military bases and field rations. It's the smallness. Not of the country. Of the version of yourself that the people who knew you before, they've kept it preserved like something in amber, and they expect you to fit back inside it. I hadn't been home in 14 months. Before that, Bahrain. Before that, a posting I still can't fully name in documents that would require 3 signatures to declassify. My father knew I was overseas. He knew I worked for the government. Beyond that, the specifics had always been complicated. He had called me twice in the last month. Left voicemails, which Richard Russell never did, which told me he was nervous. The second one, he said simply, "Whitney, please come. I'd like you there." Not we. I noticed that. So I ironed a blouse. Dark navy, not because I was trying to signal anything, just because it was the first thing I found that didn't need a second press. I pulled my hair back, low tight the way I'd worn it for 15 years without thinking. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment and thought, you look like yourself. Then I thought they won't see that. They never do. My mother died when I was 11. Breast cancer fast and then faster the way it sometimes goes with women who don't slow down long enough to catch it early. Her name was Evelyn. She liked crossword puzzles and strong coffee, and she had this laugh, sudden a little too loud for the room, the kind that embarrassed me when I was 10, and that I would give almost anything to hear now. My father remarried when I was 28. I was in the middle of a deployment and couldn't get leave for the ceremony. Diane sent me a photograph. Her in cream silk, my father in a gray suit, both of them smiling in front of a courthouse, a stranger on each side as witnesses. I kept the photo for a while. Then I didn't. I want to be fair to Diane. I've tried over the years. She wasn't cruel in any way you could easily name. She never screamed, never made scenes. What she did was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to answer, because when you can't point to a specific wound, people assume you're imagining the bleeding. What she did was narrate me, to her friends, to my father's colleagues, to anyone at any dinner table who asked about Richard's daughter. She would say things like, Whitney never quite found her footing after Evelyn passed, or She's been doing some government temp work, we're not entirely sure what. Or the one that I heard secondhand and still think about. She's a little lost, I think. We worry about her. She doesn't let people in. Lost. Temp work. Doesn't let people in. 15 years of service. 2 commendations I'm not allowed to fully describe. A GIG record that my superiors had quietly told me was among the cleanest and sharpest in the region. Cases that are still referenced in military legal training. That record that life compressed down to, she's a little lost. I drove to the house in silence. No radio. I used to need music on long drives, but somewhere in the last decade, I'd gotten comfortable with quiet. You learn that overseas. Silence isn't emptiness, it's information. The house was lit up from the outside when I turned onto the street. Warm gold light from the tall front windows, cars lining the driveway and spilling onto the curb. More cars than I expected. Diane had told my father it would be an intimate dinner. 20 people, maybe. The parking situation suggested otherwise. I sat in my car for a moment after I cut the engine. I thought about Evelyn. I don't know why exactly. Maybe the lit windows, maybe the way the house looked the same from outside, as it always had the same oak tree in the yard, the same brass porch light. She used to stand at those windows sometimes when I came home from school, already watching before I reached the front walk. I would see her silhouette and feel something settle in my chest. Safe. Home. You. I got out of the car. The front door was opened by a young woman I didn't recognize, college-aged, maybe in a white button-down and black slacks. Catering staff. She smiled and gestured me inside. The entry hall was full of sound and perfume, and the low-frequency hum of people performing their best versions of themselves. I recognized a few faces, a man named Gerald, who worked with my father in commercial real estate, a woman I vaguely remembered from a Christmas party years ago. They didn't register me. I walked through them like weather. Diane appeared from the direction of the dining room. She was in a deep green dress, her hair done carefully, a glass of white wine in one hand. She looked, I had to admit, entirely in her element. She saw me and her face arranged itself into something warm. Whitney. She leaned in, not quite a hug. You came. Your father will be so glad. A small pause, fractional. I wasn't sure you'd make it. I said I would. Of course. She touched my arm briefly, guiding me slightly, and it was only because I'd spent years reading the geometry of rooms and bodies that I noticed where she was guiding me. Not toward the main reception, toward the kitchen. I'm so glad you're here, she said. We're actually running a little behind the caterers, could really use an extra hand getting the appetizer trays out. You wouldn't mind, would you? Just until dinner's served, then you can join everyone. She said it the way you say something that's already decided. A favor framed as a question. I looked at her for one moment. Then I said, sure. Not because I didn't understand what was happening. I understood exactly what was happening. I said sure, because I was tired in a way that goes down past bone, and because I loved my father, and because there are battles you choose and battles you don't, and I had learned over a long career to be very deliberate about which ones I picked up. I went into the kitchen. I picked up a tray, and that is where I was 40 minutes later when the front door opened and the sound in the room died table by table, and I heard a voice say one word that had followed me across 3 continents and 15 years. Ironclad. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and warm butter. I want you to hold that detail because it matters the specific ordinary comfort of it. Rosemary and butter. The kind of smell that belongs to Sunday dinners and mothers who are still alive and houses where you feel like you have a right to exist. I noticed it the way I notice things I know I'm going to need later. A small anchor. Something to hold on to when the rest of the room starts moving. There were 2 catering staff in the kitchen when I came in. A young man named Eli, maybe 23, who was arranging bruschetta on a long slate board with the focused precision of someone who took their work seriously, and an older woman mid-50s who introduced herself as Pat and handed me a white cloth napkin to drape over my forearm without asking whether I needed instruction. I took the napkin. I tucked it over my arm. Old habit in a different way than she meant. Pat looked at me with the particular kindness of someone who has worked enough private events to recognize a family member who has been redirected into the service corridor. She didn't say anything about it. She just handed me the first tray, small crab cakes on parchment rounds, a little sprig of dill on each one, and said, "Main room first, then the study. Mr. Russell's in the study with a few of the gentlemen if you want to say hello." I thanked her. I carried the tray out. The main room was arranged for the occasion: extra chairs, low floral centerpieces, the good china that Diane had bought after she married my father and that I had never once eaten off of. People stood in loose clusters the way people do when they're networking, but trying not to look like they're networking. Voices layered over each other, rising and falling with the particular rhythm of a room full of people who are comfortable with their own importance. Nobody looked at me. Not really. That's the thing about carrying a tray. You become infrastructure. You're part of the event the way the tablecloths are part of the event: necessary, expected, invisible. I had been invisible in rooms before, but usually by choice. Usually because invisibility was a tactical advantage. This was a different kind. The kind that is assigned to you. The kind that says you belong to the margins of this. I moved through the room. A man named Tom Graves stepped slightly into my path, not blocking just the careless geometry of someone who hasn't had to be aware of other people's movement in a long time. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had probably been athletic once and now carried it more in his handshake than his frame. He'd known my father for years. I recognized him from Richard's Christmas cards. He looked at me and something crossed his face. Not unkindness exactly, something softer and in some ways worse. Pity. "Whitney, right?" He reached over and took a crab cake. "Good to finally meet you. Richard talks about you." A small, careful pause. "You doing okay these days?" These days. As though there had been a before that hadn't gone well. "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you. Good, good." He chewed thoughtfully. "Diane mentioned you've been between things for a while. It's tough out there, I know. Job market's rough." He nodded sincerely, the nod of a man delivering what he believed was comfort. "If you ever need an introduction anywhere, just say the word. Richard's friends are your friends." Between things. I let that sit for a moment inside me, somewhere quiet, where I keep things that need to be processed later. "That's kind of you," I said. He smiled, relieved that I'd taken it well, and turned back to his conversation. I moved on. Diane was near the fireplace with a cluster of women I didn't know. Well-dressed, animated the inner circle of whatever social architecture she'd built in this house over the last 14 years. She saw me come through with the tray and did something small, something you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. She touched the elbow of the woman beside her, a light redirecting touch, and angled her body slightly, just enough to position me in the peripheral frame of the conversation. "And of course Richard's daughter is here tonight." She was saying, her voice warm with practiced inclusion. "Whitney. She helps out around the house when she's in town." A light laugh. "She's very good about it." "Helps out around the house?" One of the women, late 40s, a strand of pearls, a face that was kind enough, glanced at me with a polite smile. The smile you give the help. Friendly. Brief. Not unkind. Just categorizing, I smiled back. I offered the tray. She took one without looking at it. I kept moving. Near the entrance to the hallway, I passed an older woman standing slightly apart from the main clusters, 70-ish silver hair, wearing the kind of simple navy dress that suggests a woman who stopped needing to impress people some years ago and found the freedom of it agreeable. She was watching the room with the patient, calm attention of someone who has been watching rooms for a very long time. She looked at me. Not through me. At me. Her name was Carol Merritt. I knew her face from photographs. She had been my mother's closest friend from college, the one who had flown in for Evelyn's funeral and stayed a week after quietly making sure our house had food and clean laundry while my father sat in his armchair and didn't speak. I had been 11. I remembered her hands mostly, capable hands, the kind that do what needs doing without announcing themselves. I hadn't seen her since I was a teenager. She looked at me now with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not pity, not the careful distancing warmth of Tom Graves. Something else. Something that looked like she was taking inventory, and what she was finding was not what she had been told to expect. She opened her mouth slightly as though she was about to say something. Then the front door opened. I was across the room. I didn't see him come in. I heard the shift first. The quality of the air changed the way it does when someone enters a space who carries a certain kind of weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just the room recalibrated. And then Diane's voice from somewhere behind me, bright with social hostess energy. "Admiral Carver, you made it. We're so delighted Richard is just in the study. Let me take you through." I went very still. The tray was in my hands. Crab cakes on parchment. A white cloth napkin over my forearm. I heard his footsteps cross the entry hall. Measured. Unhurried. And then they stopped. The conversation around me didn't drop all at once. It was gradual, like a tide going out quiet, spreading from one point in the room outward, table by table, cluster by cluster, until the only sounds were the soft instrumental music from somewhere in the ceiling and the faint tick of the clock above the mantel. Someone's fork hit porcelain. A chair scraped back. I still hadn't turned around. I didn't need to. I knew the way you know after enough years in certain rooms that this moment was already past the point where anyone in it could control what came next. Then his voice. Low, certain. The voice that had called order in courtrooms and briefing rooms and field tents across 2 decades. Ironclad. I turned around slowly. Not because I was composing myself. I was already composed. That part happened years ago in rooms with a lot higher stakes than a dinner party in McLean, Virginia. I turned slowly because I wanted to see the whole room before the room saw my face. Old habit. Tactical. You read the terrain before you commit to movement. Admiral James Carver was standing in the entry hall, still in his overcoat, a briefcase in one hand. 71 years old. Silver-haired, broad across the shoulders, in the way of men who were built for physical work and never entirely stopped. He had the posture of someone who had spent so many years standing at attention that upright had simply become his natural state, the default setting of his spine. He was looking directly at me. His face was doing something complicated. I had known James Carver for 16 years. I had stood before him in formal hearings and in hallway conversations, and in the particular intimacy of a debrief after a case that had gone badly and needed to be understood. I knew his face well enough to read it the way you read weather, not predicting exactly, just orienting. What I saw was not shock. Shock passes quickly in people like Carver. What I saw underneath the shock, which lasted maybe 2 seconds, was something that had calcified over time into something harder and more permanent. He was angry. Not at me. The geometry of it was wrong for that. It was directed past me, around me, at the room, at the situation, at whatever sequence of events had resulted in a lieutenant commander with her record standing in a private home with a catering napkin over her arm. I set the tray down on the nearest surface, a side table near the wall. I did it quietly without ceremony because making a production of it would have been its own kind of statement, and I wasn't ready to make statements yet. The room was very still. Diane had gone quiet mid-sentence. I could feel it without looking, the specific silence of someone whose social script has just been interrupted by a variable they didn't account for. She was standing somewhere to my left, and I knew without seeing her that her face had arranged itself into an expression of pleasant uncertainty, waiting to understand, waiting to see which way to pivot. Carver crossed the room. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked the way he always walked, deliberate straight line, no wasted movement until he was standing in front of me. Then he stopped. He was a few inches taller than me. He looked at me for one long moment, the way you look at something you need to confirm is real. Then he extended his hand, not the casual hand of a social greeting, the formal one, the one that means something. I took it. "Lieutenant Commander Russell," he said. Full title, full name. Clear enough to carry across the room without raising his voice, because James Carver had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. I heard a sound from somewhere, a small intake of breath, multiple sources, the kind that happens when a room recalibrates its understanding of a situation. "Sir," I said. He held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. Then he released it and looked around the room slowly, the way a man does when he wants to make sure a point has landed. "I apologize for the interruption," he said to no one in particular and to everyone. "I wasn't expecting—" He stopped, restarted. "I wasn't aware that Whitney would be here this evening." Diane stepped forward from wherever she had been standing. Her voice came out smooth and gracious, the voice she used when she was navigating uncertainty in public. "Admiral Carver, yes, Whitney is Richard's daughter. We're so pleased she could join us tonight." A small light laugh, the kind that reframes and minimizes in a single breath. "She's been helping us get the evening together." Carver looked at Diane. I have seen that look directed at opposing counsel, at witnesses who were not telling the truth, at superior officers who were making decisions that were going to cost people. It was not an aggressive look. It was worse than aggressive. It was a look of complete, quiet, patient assessment, the look of a man cataloging everything and deciding what to do with it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said very pleasantly, "Is that so?" 2 words. A temperature drop of about 10 degrees. Tom Graves was nearby. I realized close enough to have heard the exchange, close enough that I could see in my peripheral vision the particular stillness of a man who is rapidly revising something he thought he understood. His glass was paused halfway to his mouth. The woman with the pearls, the one Diane had been talking to when I passed with the tray, the one who had given me the polite, brief, categorizing smile, was looking at me now with a different kind of attention. Still polite. But the category had shifted and she wasn't sure yet which one to put me in. Carol Merritt across the room had not moved. She was watching all of it. Her expression was unreadable to most people, I imagined. To me, it read as something very close to grim satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular kind of reckoning and is now watching it begin. Carver turned back to me. The formality in his posture softened by exactly 1 degree, which from James Carver was the equivalent of a long embrace from most people. "Come sit with me," he said. "I'd like to catch up." Not a request. Not quite. The kind of statement that assumes its own compliance because the person making it has never had reason to doubt it. "Of course," I said. I left the tray on the side table. I didn't look at Diane. I didn't look at Tom Graves or the woman with the pearls or any of the other faces that were now watching me with that recalibrated attention. I walked with Carver toward the sitting room at the far end of the hall, and I was aware very precisely of the sound of the room resuming behind us, voices restarting low and urgent, and reshuffled the particular sound of a group of people quietly, rapidly updating their understanding of what they were looking at. Diane's voice rose above it for a moment, still smooth, still gracious, redirecting the room back toward the evening she had planned. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure. The way you feel weather coming before the sky shows it. It wasn't over. It was in the most precise sense of the phrase just beginning. The sitting room was quieter. A single lamp on the side table, a window looking out onto the dark backyard, the muffled sound of the party continuing on the other side of the wall. Carver sat down in the armchair nearest the window, not the largest chair in the room, just the one with the clearest sightline to the door. Some habits run too deep to be decorating choices. I sat across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. That was fine. James Carver had always understood the uses of silence. He had taught me in the early years that the lawyer who speaks first in a quiet room is usually the one who needed the silence to end a need is information. He looked at me steadily. "How long have you been back?" he said. Not quite a question. 3 months. "And no one in this house knows?" "My father knows I'm back in Virginia. He knows I work for the government. The rest..." I paused. "Complicated." Carver made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment the way he did when he was deciding how to say something. "I was briefed last month," he said. "On your new posting." I kept my expression neutral. "Then you know I can't discuss it." "I'm not asking you to." He looked up. "I'm telling you, I know what you walked away from in Bahrain. I know what the last 2 years looked like. And I'm telling you that I walked into this room tonight and saw you carrying a serving tray, and I need you to help me understand how that happened." I was quiet for a moment. "It's one evening," I said. "Whitney. She asked me to help. I said yes. It wasn't worth the argument." He looked at me the way he had looked at Diane earlier, the patient cataloging look. Then he said quietly, "It's never just one evening with people like that. You know that." I did know that. I had always known that. But knowing something and having the energy to fight it are 2 different countries, and I had spent a long time commuting between them. Before I could answer, the door opened. My father stood in the doorway. Richard Russell, at 68, was a man who had once been physically imposing and had softened into something gentler, still tall, still broad-shouldered, but with a quality of apology about him. Now a slight forward lean, as though he had spent enough years accommodating other people's discomfort that it had become structural. He looked at me, then at Carver, then at me again. "Whitney." His voice was careful. "I heard someone said James had..." "Richard!" Carver stood. They shook hands briefly, the handshake of men who know each other professionally and respect each other adequately. Then Carver looked at my father with that same steady regard and said, "I didn't realize Whitney was going to be here tonight." "Of course she's here," my father said. "She's my daughter." "Yes." A beat. "She is." Something in the way Carver said it made my father go very still. The particular stillness of a man who has just heard an implication he isn't sure he wants to examine. I stood up. "Dad, it's fine. Go back to your guests." Whitney. I mean it. Go. I'll come out in a few minutes. He looked at me for a long moment. Richard Russell had always had good instincts. It was one of the things I loved about him even now, even after years of watching those instincts get overridden by other considerations. He knew right now that something was happening that he didn't fully understand. I could see it in his face, the knowing and the reluctance to know more. He went. The door closed. Carver sat back down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She told people you were temp work." "Yes. Government temp work. That's the phrase she uses." He was quiet again. Outside in the hall, I could hear the party voices, soft music, the clink of glassware, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. Then Carver said, without looking up, "You remember the Alderman case?" I went still. The Alderman case. 7 years ago, a classified joint operation in the Gulf, 11 Navy SEALs, accused of unauthorized engagement following a mission that had gone wrong in ways that were still not fully declassified. I had prosecuted the defense, meaning I had been the one standing between those 11 men and a military tribunal that had been, for reasons I later understood more completely, extremely motivated to find them guilty. We won. Barely. 3 months of work that I still can't fully describe in any document available to the public. "I remember it," I said. "The leak." Carver said, "The operational details that appeared in that defense contractor newsletter 2 weeks before the tribunal. The leak that almost ended the case and nearly got you brought up on charges." My hands were still in my lap. I kept them that way. "I remember," I said again. Careful, neutral. "We found the chain," Carver said quietly. "Not all of it. Not enough for a criminal referral on the civilian side, but enough to reconstruct it." He paused. "It started with a phone call. Someone who knew your deployment schedule called a man named Gregory Fales, defense industry consultant, had media contacts. The call came from a number registered to a shared household account." The room was very quiet. "This household," I said. My voice came out level. Trained level. The level I used in courtrooms when I already knew the answer to the question I was asking. Carver looked at me directly. "We believe so. We can't prove intent. It may have been careless. It may have been something else. But the origin point, yes. This address." I breathed in, slowly, out. The way you do when something you have suspected for 7 years is suddenly sitting in the room with you, wearing a shape you can point to. I had known. Not known with evidence, not known the way I would need to know in a courtroom. But I had known the way you know things in your body before your mind will authorize them. The timing had never made sense otherwise. The specificity of what leaked had never made sense otherwise. I had protected my father by not pushing, by letting the investigation close without my full cooperation on the civilian angle, by absorbing the suspicion quietly and continuing. And she had stood in this house for 7 more years and narrated me as lost. I looked at the window, the dark backyard, the oak tree at the edge of the light. "Does she know you're here tonight?" I asked. "No," Carver said. "Richard invited me 3 weeks ago. I accepted because of the business matter. I had no idea." He stopped. "Whitney, I had no idea she had put you in an apron." Something moved through me then. Not rage, not relief. Something older and more complicated than either the feeling of a thing long carried being named out loud by someone else for the first time. The specific, exhausting, necessary relief of not being the only person in the room who can see something. I sat with it for a moment, then I stood up. I think," I said, "it's time to go back out." We walked back out together. I want to tell you about the Alderman case. Not because I need you to think well of me, I stopped needing that from strangers a long time ago, but because what happened in that courtroom is the only way to understand what happened in that sitting room, and what happened in that sitting room is the only way to understand everything that came after. Some stories only make sense if you know what the person has already survived. So let me take you back. 7 years. A naval air station in Bahrain, a windowless conference room that smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaning fluid, and 11 men sitting in a row who were about to lose everything they had built their lives around. Their names I still can't give you. Operational security even now. But I can tell you who they were in the ways that mattered. The oldest was 44, a chief petty officer who had served 22 years, whose daughter had been born while he was on his 3rd deployment, who carried her school photograph in the chest pocket of his uniform every single day. The youngest was 26, a kid from rural Tennessee, who had enlisted at 18 because it was that, or a county with no jobs and no future, who had turned himself into one of the sharpest SEAL operators his unit had ever produced. 11 men, 11 lives, a mission that had gone wrong. The official version, the one the tribunal had been handed, said they had engaged a civilian structure without authorization during a counterinsurgency operation, that the engagement had resulted in casualties that were not legitimate military targets, and that the unit had then falsified their after-action reports to conceal it. The evidence package was neat, thorough, the kind of thorough that takes time and intention to build. Too thorough. That was the first thing I noticed. I had been assigned the case 3 days after the charges were filed, given a box of documents and 48 hours to decide whether I was taking it. My supervising officer at the time made very clear without saying it directly that a conviction was the preferred outcome, that the political pressure from 3 different directions was significant, that the optics of acquittal were complicated. I took the case. I want to be honest with you about what the first week looked like. I sat with that evidence package every night until 2, 3 in the morning, reading and rereading, and what I felt was not confidence. What I felt was the particular cold weight of a case where the architecture of the lie is better constructed than most of the truth I'd ever been asked to defend. Someone had built this. Not sloppily, not in a hurry, someone with access and patience and a very specific reason to want these 11 men convicted. That was the question. Not what happened on the mission, I could reconstruct that. The question was why. The answer took 6 weeks to find. There was a brigadier general named Marcus Holt who had commanded the regional operation within which the SEAL unit had been operating. Holt was by every official metric a decorated and respected officer. He was also, as I discovered through 400 hours of document review and 11 separate witness interviews conducted under conditions I cannot describe, a man who had made a series of decisions in the months prior to the mission that were indefensible, logistical decisions, intelligence assessment decisions, targeting decisions that had directly created the conditions under which things went wrong. The SEAL unit hadn't falsified their reports. They had accurately reported a mission that Holt's own decisions had made a disaster, and Holt had constructed the evidence package against them to ensure that disaster had someone else's name on it. I built the counter case in 8 weeks. I want to be accurate about what that looked like because people sometimes imagine legal work as clean and procedural, and it is almost never that. It looked like sleeping 4 hours a night. It looked like finding one witness who would talk, then using that thread to find another, then another. It looked like a deposition with a logistics officer who cried for 20 minutes before he told me the truth, and me sitting across from him, not rushing him, not performing sympathy, just waiting because he needed to get there in his own time, and I needed what was at the end of it. It looked like the moment I walked into court with a file that was airtight, and the moment 2 days before the tribunal when significant portions of that file appeared in a defense industry newsletter with enough specific detail to blow 3 of my witnesses' operational covers. I rebuilt in 48 hours. I don't say that to impress you. I say it because those 48 hours are the reason I now understand, in a way I didn't before, what people mean when they talk about what you find out about yourself when there is nothing left to rely on except what you actually are. We won. Holt was quietly relieved of command 6 months later, not publicly, not with the accountability those 11 men deserved, but removed. The chief petty officer with his daughter's photograph retired with full honors the following year. The kid from Tennessee went on to complete 2 more tours and eventually became an instructor at BUD/S. I know because I checked. I always check. What I got was a commendation I cannot display and an investigation into the leak that spent 8 months going nowhere, and a suspicion I carried alone because pursuing it would have meant destroying my father's marriage on evidence that was not yet conclusive and a certainty I could not yet prove. That is what I had been carrying for 7 years, into every room, including this one. Carver walked beside me down the hallway. The party's sounds grew louder as we approached voices, music, the clink of glassware, the world proceeding as though nothing had shifted. I thought about those 11 men. I thought about the chief petty officer's daughter's photograph. I thought about the kid from Tennessee. I thought about standing in this hallway at 11 years old and seeing my mother's silhouette in the window and feeling safe. Then I thought about Diane's voice, light and pleasant, telling a room full of strangers that Richard's daughter did temp work and helped out around the house and was a little lost. Something very quiet and very old settled in my chest. Peace matters more than recognition. I had believed that for a long time. I still believed it, but there is a difference between choosing peace and being assigned invisibility, and I had spent 7 years confusing one for the other. I had carried those 11 men home. Every one of them. It was time to let someone carry something for me. We stepped back into the main room. The room noticed us before we spoke. That is the thing about walking into a space with someone who carries a certain kind of weight. The room adjusts before it knows why. Conversations didn't stop, but they thinned. Eyes moved toward us and then moved away with the careful sideways attention of people who are trying to look like they aren't watching. Diane was near the dining room entrance talking to a man I recognized as a local city councilman, late 50s, silver tie, the practiced smile of a man who had spent decades performing accessibility. She saw us come in. Her smile held perfectly. Just 1 beat too long. That beat told me everything. She knew something had happened in that sitting room. She didn't know what. And not knowing was making the smile work harder than usual. My father was across the room near the fireplace speaking with Tom Graves and another man I didn't recognize. He looked up when we entered. His eyes went to me, then to Carver, then back to me. The apology in his face was quiet and old and complicated, the apology of a man who has been making the same compromise for 14 years and has only just in this moment begun to understand what it has cost. I didn't look away from him. I let him see my face clearly, not angry, not accusing, just present. The way I had not let myself be fully present in this house for a very long time. Carol Merritt was still near the far wall, still with her glass, still watching the room with that patient, undeceived attention. When she saw me come in with Carver, she did something small, a slight lift of her chin barely perceptible. The acknowledgement of one person to another across a crowded room that says, "I see you. I've been seeing you." Carver stopped near the center of the room. He did it deliberately, not dramatically, not with the theatrics of someone who wants an audience, but with the calm authority of a man who understands that sometimes the right position in a room is the one that makes leaving or ignoring impossible. He had done this in courtrooms, in briefing rooms, the physics of presence. You don't announce yourself. You simply occupy the space in a way that makes the space orient toward you. It worked the way it always worked. The conversations thinned further. The room collectively, without being asked, began to pay attention. Diane glided over, graceful, unruffled on the outside, though I could see with the precision of someone who had spent years reading people under pressure the fine tension in her jaw. The smile still perfect. "Admiral Carver, can I get you a drink?" We were just about to move everyone toward the dining room. "In a moment," Carver said pleasantly. Then he looked at the room in that steady, encompassing way and said at a volume that was entirely conversational and carried perfectly, "I want to say something if no one minds." Nobody said they minded. Nobody would. He paused for one moment. The pause of a man choosing words that have weight and wanting them to land in the right order. "I've known Whitney Russell for 16 years, he said. "I was her commanding officer for the first 7 of those. I have been in the years since someone who has followed her career with considerable admiration, and considerable, I'll be honest with you, considerable pride." The room was quiet. The instrumental music from the ceiling seemed to lower itself obligingly. "I want to be clear about something for anyone in this room who may not have the full picture." Another pause, not for effect, for precision. Carver had never been a man who used pauses for effect. He used them to make sure the next thing he said would be received clearly. "Lieutenant Commander Whitney Russell has served this country for 15 years, with a distinction that most people in this room, most people in any room, will never be asked to match. I am not at liberty to detail every aspect of her record. What I can tell you is that there are men alive today who would not be alive today without her work. I can tell you that her name appears in training materials used to instruct the next generation of military legal officers. And I can tell you that she is one of the finest lawyers and one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege of serving alongside." He stopped. The room was very, very still. Tom Graves had set his glass down. The woman with the pearls was looking at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something between recalibration and something that looked at its edges like shame. The councilman beside Diane had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, a degree away from her and toward the center of the room the way people orient toward sources of gravity. Diane's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. I could see it, the specific internal quality of a person whose narrative has just been publicly contradicted and who is rapidly, silently calculating the damage. My father was not moving at all. Carver looked at me then. The formality dropped one more degree. "I walked in tonight," he said, "and I saw her carrying a serving tray." He said it simply. No judgment in his voice. No performance of outrage. Just the fact placed in the room like an object on a table. "Here it is. Look at it." The silence stretched. Then Carol Merritt spoke. She had moved from her position near the wall without anyone noticing the particular gift of women of a certain age who have learned that rooms stop tracking them and who have made of that invisibility a kind of power. She was standing now near the edge of the group, and her voice when she spoke was not loud but carried the same quality as Carver's, the quality of someone who has no reason to perform. "I knew her mother," she said. "Evelyn. We were friends for 30 years. She paused. "Evelyn would have walked through fire for that girl, and she would have walked through fire for anyone who treated her the way she deserved to be treated." She looked at Diane, not with hostility, with something cleaner than that. "And I think," Carol said, that we have all been told a story about Whitney tonight that does not match the young woman I am looking at." The room absorbed this. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I think there may be some Carol. I appreciate that, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Diane," my father's voice. Quiet. From across the room. One word. Her name. But something in how he said it made her stop. He was looking at her. Richard Russell, who had spent 14 years choosing the easier silence, who had loved his daughter from a careful distance because it was less complicated than the alternative. He was looking at his wife with the expression of a man who has just arrived somewhere he should have reached a long time ago. Then he looked at me. "Whitney," he said, "come sit at the table. Please." Not a request redirected through Diane. Not an apology deferred. Direct. Simple. His voice doing what it had not done in a very long time. Choosing, but before I could answer, before the evening could move toward whatever resolution my father was reaching for, Carver turned to me and said very quietly, "Just for me. There's more. The chain I told you about. Gregory Fales has cooperated, fully. We have documentation now that goes further than this address." He paused. "It goes further than carelessness, Whitney. The investigators believe it was intentional." The room was still moving around us, people shifting, my father crossing toward me, Diane standing frozen near the dining room entrance. Intentional. 7 years. 11 men. 48 hours of rebuilding a case from pieces. Intentional. I stood very still and let that word settle into every corner of what I had been carrying. There is a kind of confrontation that looks nothing like what people imagine when they hear the word. People imagine raised voices, accusations flung across rooms, doors slammed, the operatic version of reckoning, the one where everything feels proportional to its own importance. I had seen that kind. I had prosecuted cases where that kind was the evidence. What happened in that dining room was different. It was quieter, and in some ways it was harder because quiet confrontations require you to stay completely present, to not let the adrenaline carry you, to say only what is true and only what is necessary, and to mean every word of it precisely. My father had asked me to come to the table. I came. Diane had not moved from her position near the dining room entrance. The guests were in a state of collective suspended uncertainty, the social equivalent of a held breath. Nobody was eating. Nobody had sat down. The evening had been redirected by something larger than Diane's seating chart, and nobody was sure yet what the new order of events was supposed to be. I stopped a few feet from her. I want to be precise about my own interior state in that moment because I think it matters. I was not trembling. I was not fighting tears. I was not riding the hot current of the anger that had been building for 7 years, because that current, if I rode, it would carry me somewhere I didn't want to go. What I was still. The kind of still that is the opposite of numbness. Not the absence of feeling, but the complete organization of it. Every feeling I had in that moment was present and accounted for and in its correct position. I looked at Diane. She looked back at me. The smile was gone now. There was nothing left to sustain it. What remained was something I had not seen on her face before. Not guilt, not exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been managing a situation for a very long time and has just watched the management fail. She was calculating. Even now. I could see it. I said, "I'm not going to do this in front of your guests." Something moved through her face. Relief fractional, the misreading of a sentence that had not finished. "That's," she started. I'm not going to do it for their sake, I said. Not for yours. I want you to be clear about that distinction. The relief withdrew. I glanced at my father, who had come to stand a few feet to my left, close enough to be present far enough that he understood this was not his to manage. He looked older than he had an hour ago, not in a bad way exactly, more like a man from whom something has been set down that he had been carrying for long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight. Dad, I said, I need you to hear this. All of it. Not a version of it, all of it. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has decided. I turned back to Diane. 7 years ago, I said, I was investigated for leaking classified operational information during a case. The investigation was resolved. My record was cleared. What I was never able to prove at the time was where the leak originated. I paused. I know now. I have known for some time in the way that you know things before you can prove them. Tonight, I have been told that investigators have documentation, that it was not careless, that it was intentional. Diane's chin lifted slightly, the micro-expression of a person preparing a defense. Whitney, I don't know what you think. I'm not asking you to confirm it tonight, I said. I'm not asking you to confess. I'm not asking for anything from you right now except that you stop pretending you don't understand what I'm describing. Silence. That case, I said. Those were 11 men. Not abstractions. Not a career setback. 11 men with families and records and 20 years of service each who almost lost everything because someone needed to ensure that the evidence pointing at the right person didn't survive long enough to matter. I kept my voice level. I spent 48 hours rebuilding that case after the leak. I won. They came home. But there was a version of events, a very plausible version one, that almost happened where they didn't, where they were convicted of something they didn't do, where their lives were over. I let that sit. I want you to know, I said, that I carried that, the possibility of that outcome. I carried it for 7 years. And I carried the knowledge of where it came from, and I stayed quiet because exposing it would have fractured my father's life, and I loved him more than I needed to be right. My father made a sound. Very quiet. The sound of a man absorbing something that is costing him something. I did not look away from Diane. I am not staying quiet anymore, I said. Not because I need this room to see it. Not because I want you punished tonight in front of your guests, but because my father deserves the truth, and because I deserve to have said it out loud in this house at least once. Diane was very still. For one moment, one unguarded moment that I don't think she intended something passed through her face that was not calculation and was not performance. Something that looked at its edges like the expression of a person who has lived inside a version of themselves that they constructed carefully and have just seen it made insufficient by the proximity of something real. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the composure reassembled. Not fully the seams showed now in a way they hadn't before, but enough. I think, she said carefully, that there are conversations that should happen privately. Yes, I said. There are, and they will, but not tonight. Tonight I am going to sit at my father's table and have dinner with his guests, and you are going to let that happen without narrating it. The word hung in the air between us. Narrating. I watched her recognize it, the specific word, its specific reference. The years of it. She heard it. Tom Graves, somewhere behind me, set his glass down on a surface. The sound of a man making himself very small and very still. The councilman in the silver tie was looking at a point slightly above everyone's heads with the focused neutrality of a man who has decided this is not an evening he will be referencing publicly. And then Carver from across the room did something I did not expect. He began to move toward the dining table. He pulled out a chair, not the chair at the head, which was Richard's, not the one beside it, which was Diane's, but the chair directly across from both of them, the chair with the clearest sightline to the whole table. He looked at me. "Lieutenant Commander," he said. "The title again. Deliberate. Public. Will you sit?" I looked at my father. Richard Russell was already moving. He pulled out the chair to his right, not Diane's chair, which was to his left but the right, and he looked at me with the eyes of a man who understood maybe for the first time with the full weight of understanding what his silence had cost his daughter and what it was going to cost him now to make a different choice. "Please," he said, "sit with me." I sat. And after a moment, a long moment, a moment full of the specific weight of a situation reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, the rest of the room sat too. Diane sat last, upright, composed, the seams still showing. The evening continued, but it was not the evening she had planned. Dinner was served. I want you to understand how strange that was, the absolute, almost surreal ordinariness of it. Pat came out from the kitchen with the first course, and Eli followed with the bread, and the table received them with the reflexive courtesy of people who have been raised to behave correctly at dinner regardless of what has just happened in the room adjacent to it. Forks were picked up, wine was poured. Someone asked Gerald about a property development in Fairfax County, and Gerald answered, and for a few minutes the surface of the evening reassembled itself into something that looked, from a distance, like a normal dinner party. But surfaces are not rooms, and the room had changed. I sat to my father's right. Carver sat across from us. Carol Merritt had been moved or had moved herself with the quiet authority of a woman who has decided where she belongs to the seat beside me. She didn't make a production of it. She simply sat down, unfolded her napkin, and gave me one brief level look that communicated everything it needed to communicate and nothing extra. I was glad she was there. I hadn't expected to feel that. But I did. Diane sat at the other end of the table. She ate. She spoke when spoken to. She even smiled twice, once at the councilman, once at Gerald's wife. The smile was technically correct. Everything about her performance was technically correct. But the table had a new geometry now, and everyone at it could feel it, even the people who didn't fully understand what had happened, even the people who would go home tonight and reconstruct the evening in their own minds and arrive at slightly different versions of the story. The truth had been placed in the room. You can't unplace it. It was Tom Graves who surprised me. He was 3 seats down on my father's left, and for the first half of dinner, he had been very quiet, quieter than I had ever imagined a man like Tom Graves could be, based on 30 minutes of acquaintance. He ate carefully. He listened more than he spoke. And I could see in the way I see things in people's faces after enough years of reading witnesses that he was working something out, some internal accounting. The particular uncomfortable arithmetic of a person tallying what they believed against what they now know. Midway through the main course, he looked up at me across the table. "Whitney," he said, quietly enough that it didn't command the whole table, loudly enough that the people nearest us heard. I looked at him. "What I said earlier." He paused. The pause of a man who has rehearsed something and is finding the rehearsal insufficient to the moment. "About introductions. About being between things." Another pause. "I owe you an apology for that. I was repeating something I'd been told, and I should have asked. I should have asked you directly." The table near us had gone quiet. Not performatively, just the natural quiet of people who recognize a genuine moment and don't want to interrupt it. I looked at Tom Graves for a moment. He was uncomfortable, genuinely thoroughly uncomfortable in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being wrong and is finding that being wrong in public has a specific texture that he is going to remember. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." He nodded, looked down at his plate, looked up again. "For what it's worth," he said, "Richard talks about you all the time, has for years. He's always been proud of you. I want you to know that." My father to my left went very still. I did not look at him immediately. I gave him a moment. Because some things need a moment before they can be witnessed. Then I looked at him. Richard Russell was not a man who cried easily. He was from the generation of men who had been taught that composure was a form of respect, that feelings expressed publicly were a kind of imposition. He was sitting very straight, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were bright in the way of eyes that are doing a great deal of work to remain ordinary. He put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After 68 years of living inside his particular silences, I had learned to read what the silences contained. This one contained 14 years of compromise and the cost of it, and the specific irreversible recognition that cost had been paid by someone who had never presented him the bill. I turned my hand over under his and held it. That was all. We went on eating. But it was Carol who completed it. She waited until dessert, the patient strategic timing of a woman who understands that a room has to arrive at its own readiness before certain things can be said. Then she set down her fork and looked down the table at Diane with the clear, unhurried regard of someone who has nothing to lose and is finding that liberating. "Diane," she said, "I've been sitting here tonight thinking about Evelyn." Diane looked at her. Something behind her eyes moved carefully like an animal assessing the distance to cover. "Evelyn used to say," Carol continued, "that the cruelest thing you can do to a person is make them doubt the value of what they've built. Not attack it directly, just consistently quietly make them feel like it doesn't quite count, like they're still waiting to become something." She paused. She said it because it had been done to her once, by someone who was threatened by her. She recognized the pattern. The table was completely quiet now, not the held breath quiet of before. Something more settled. The quiet of a room that has arrived somewhere. "I think Evelyn would have recognized the pattern here," Carol said. "I think she would have said something about it a long time ago. And I'm genuinely sorry that she wasn't here to say it, and that it took this long for anyone else to." She looked at me when she said the last part. I held her gaze. My mother's friend. 70 years old, silver-haired, sitting in my childhood home, 14 years after the last time I'd seen her saying what my mother would have said. I managed just barely to keep the level. "Thank you," I said. And meant it in all the ways it was possible to mean something. Diane said nothing. She looked at her dessert plate. Her composure was intact, but it was a different kind of intact than it had been 3 hours ago. The intact of something that has been fundamentally reorganized under the surface that will require significant reconstruction before it can be fully deployed again. Carver across the table caught my eye. He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast. Just an acknowledgement. The private minimal signal of one person to another that says, "I see you. You did well. It's done." I raised mine in return. Outside the dining room windows, the night was dark and quiet, the oak tree a shape against the sky, the street beyond it ordinary and still. Inside the table, finished dessert. Someone laughed at something Gerald said. The councilman relaxed his silver tie by a fraction. The evening moved as evenings do toward its end, but something that had been wrong for a very long time was now in the most essential way no longer unspoken. The guests left by 10:30. They left the way guests leave after an evening that has been more than they expected, with a certain careful politeness, a few extra handshakes, the particular warmth of people who have witnessed something real and are slightly altered by it and don't quite have the vocabulary for that yet. The councilman shook my hand on the way out and held it a beat longer than the handshake warranted. Gerald's wife told me quietly that she had an uncle who served in the Navy and that she hoped I'd come back to visit. Tom Graves stopped in the doorway and looked at me one more time, the look of a man who was going to be thinking about this evening for a while, and then nodded and left without saying anything else, which was exactly right. Carol Merritt was the last to go. She put on her coat in the entry hall and then turned to me and took both my hands in hers the way she must have done when I was 11 years old in the days after the funeral, though I don't remember it specifically. I only remember the hands. Capable, warm, the hands of someone who does what needs doing. She looked at me for a long moment. "She would have been so proud of you," she said. "Not because of the rank, not because of any of it. Just you." She pressed my hands once. "Call me. I mean that. I'd like to have lunch." "I will," I said. She left. The door closed. The house was quiet in the specific way of a house after a party disordered a little emptied out the ghost of 100 conversations still in the air. Glasses on surfaces, napkins refolded on chairs, the good china needing to be put away. Diane had gone upstairs before the last guests left. I heard her on the stairs during the final round of goodbyes, the specific creak of the third step, the one I had memorized at age 7, the one she had never learned to avoid because she had never been a child in this house. I heard her door close, not slammed, closed with the deliberate quietness of a woman managing her exit. My father and I stood in the entry hall. He was still in his dinner jacket, hands in his pockets looking at the floor in the way he looked at things when he was finding words. Richard Russell had never been a man of easy speech. He communicated better in presence than in language, in the long silences of car rides and the particular quality of his attention when he was listening. I had learned over 42 years to read him in the gaps between what he said. The gap right now was enormous. "Dad," I said, "you don't have to." "I do," he said. "I do have to." He looked up. "I knew. Not the specifics. Not what James told you tonight. But I knew something was. I knew she had been. I knew the story she told about you wasn't." He stopped. Started again. "I told myself it was just her way, that it came from insecurity and not malice, that you were strong enough to absorb it." A pause. "I used your strength as a reason not to intervene. And that was wrong, Whitney. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The words came out without performance, flat and honest and costing him something. I stood with that for a moment. There was a part of me, the part that had driven to this house tonight, not wanting to come, the part that had stood in the kitchen with a serving tray and said sure, that wanted to let him carry the weight of the apology a little longer. The part that knew how much of my life I had spent absorbing something he could have interrupted. But there was another part, older. The part that remembered a man sitting in an armchair for a week after Evelyn died and still making sure I had lunch every day, imperfectly sandwiches that were too much peanut butter and not enough jelly, but there every day made by hands that were grieving. The part that remembered him driving 6 hours each way to attend my commissioning ceremony, sitting in the front row in a good suit, crying in the way of men who cry by going very still and hoping nobody notices. He had not been perfect. He had not protected me the way I needed to be protected. He had loved me from inside a compromise that should not have been made. But he had loved me. That part had never been in question. "I know," I said. "I know you're sorry." He nodded. His jaw worked slightly. "The investigation," he said. "What James described the leak if Diane—" "There will be a process," I said. "I don't know yet what it looks like on the civilian side. James is working with the investigators. Whatever needs to happen will happen, and when it does, I'll tell you what I can." I paused. "But that's not for tonight. Tonight, I just need you to know that I'm all right. I've been all right. I need you to believe that." "I do." He looked at me. "I just wish I'd made it easier for you to show me." That landed somewhere deep. We stood in the entry hall for a while longer, not talking much, just existing in the same space the way we used to when I was young, and words weren't necessary, and the house was full of Evelyn, and everything was simpler and harder in equal measure. He made tea eventually the same way he'd always made it, too strong in the big ceramic mugs that had been in the cabinet since before I could remember. We sat at the kitchen table and drank it. It was past midnight when I drove home. 3 weeks later, my father called. He called on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. Richard Russell was a Sunday afternoon caller, methodical about it, the kind of man who scheduled things even when he didn't need to. A Tuesday call meant something unscheduled, something that couldn't wait for the right day. I picked up on the second ring. "She's leaving," he said. Not preamble, not softening. "Diane, we've talked, several times. The investigators contacted her last week. She's retained a lawyer." A long pause. "She didn't deny it, Whitney. When I asked her directly, she didn't deny it." I was standing at my kitchen window looking out at the parking lot of my apartment complex in the thin winter morning light. A woman was loading groceries into a car, an ordinary Tuesday, the world keeping moving anyway. "Dad," I said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His voice was quiet. I'm sad. It's sad. But I'm not sorry the truth is out. I should have found it a long time ago." Another pause. "I should have looked harder." We talked for a while. Not about Diane mostly, about the house, about Christmas, whether I would come, about a trip he was thinking of taking somewhere he and Evelyn had always meant to go. Portugal, maybe. He had found a photograph of the two of them from before I was born somewhere in the back of a drawer, both of them young and laughing at something outside the frame. "She looks like you," he said. "Or I suppose you look like her." "I know," I said. "I'll take it." He laughed. Sudden, a little too loud for the phone. Evelyn's laugh. I had always heard it in him, buried under the years of quieter grieving. There it was. I stood at the window and listened to my father laugh, and let myself feel for the first time in a long time the specific, uncomplicated warmth of being known by someone who has always known you imperfectly, inadequately, with long gaps and wrong silences, but known you. It was enough. For now, it was enough. A year is a long time, and sometimes it isn't long at all. It depends on what you're measuring. If you're measuring distance, the distance between who you were at the beginning of it and who you are at the end, then a year can be enormous. The kind of enormous that makes you look back at the person you were 12 months ago with something between recognition and tenderness and a quiet, complicated relief that you are no longer exactly her. I am sitting at a desk in a building I am not going to name in a city that is not a surprise to anyone who has followed my career on a morning in late autumn, when the light through the window is the particular pale gold of a season ending and something else preparing to begin. I have a cup of coffee that has gone cold because I've been sitting here thinking instead of drinking it. There is a file open in front of me, a new case, a new set of facts, a new configuration of people who need someone to stand between them and an outcome that is wrong. In a few minutes, I will close this window, pick up that file, and go be that person. But first, I want to finish telling you this. My father went to Portugal in March. He sent me a photograph from Lisbon, a narrow street, late afternoon light terracotta rooftops. He was standing in the middle of the frame, squinting slightly into the sun, looking more like himself than he had in years. I put it on my desk. It's still there. The investigation into the Alderman leak concluded in the spring. I am not at liberty to describe the outcome in full. What I can tell you is that the documentation Carver had described was sufficient. What I can tell you is that the process went where it needed to go. What I can tell you is that I was not required to testify. My name was kept out of the primary proceedings at the request of my new posting for reasons that made sense, and that I accepted without resentment, because I had learned over a long career the difference between justice and visibility, and had made my peace with the fact that they are not always the same thing. The 11 men from the Alderman case will never know what happened this spring. The chief petty officer is retired now, coaching youth baseball in North Carolina, his daughter in her second year of college. The kid from Tennessee I got word through a channel I won't specify made instructor at BUD/S last year. They are living their lives, which is the point which has always been the point. I had lunch with Carol Merritt in February. A small Italian place in Georgetown, the kind that has been there for 30 years and doesn't need to advertise. We talked for 3 hours. She told me stories about my mother that I hadn't heard. Evelyn at 23, reckless and funny, and impossibly stubborn, the version of her that existed before she was my mother, the version I had only ever been able to imagine. Carol cried once, briefly. I let her. We made plans to do it again in the spring, and we kept them. My father and I talk every Sunday now. He calls at 2 in the afternoon, which is when he's always been most himself after lunch before the evening settles in the part of the day that belongs to no particular obligation. We don't always talk about anything important. Sometimes we talk about the news, or the property he's working on, or a book he's reading. Sometimes there are silences. They are different silences than before. The kind that don't need to be filled because they aren't hiding anything. I think that is what repair actually looks like most of the time. Not one dramatic evening, not a single conversation that resolves everything into clarity and forgiveness. Just Sunday phone calls. The gradual, imperfect, willing accumulation of honesty over time. The decision made again and again in small moments to be present instead of managed. It's harder than it sounds. It's also the only thing that works. There is one more thing I want to tell you. The call sign. Ironclad. People assume when they hear it, when Carver said it across that dinner party and the room went quiet, they assume it means something about toughness, impenetrability. A person who can't be broken, who doesn't yield, who takes the impact and shows nothing. That's not what it means. That's not what it ever meant. I got it in my 3rd year of JAG work after a case that had gone 6 months and cost me more than I knew how to account for at the time. A witness I had relied on recanted under pressure. Evidence I had built a section of the case around was ruled inadmissible on a technicality that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. The case survived barely, and we won barely, and afterward one of the senior NCOs in the unit, a man named Reyes, who had been watching the proceedings for weeks, pulled me aside in the hallway. He said, I've watched a lot of lawyers in a lot of rooms. Most of them, when something goes wrong, you can see it on their face. They leak. You don't leak. You just reset and keep going. Like one of those old warships. Take the hit below the waterline and keep moving. He meant it as a compliment about composure. I've thought about it differently for a long time now, because the thing about an ironclad, the thing about those old ships that people forget when they talk about armor and imperviousness, is that they weren't built to be invulnerable. Nothing is invulnerable. They were built to take damage and remain functional, to absorb what would destroy something less constructed and continue doing what they were built to do. That's different. That's a different thing entirely. It doesn't mean you don't feel it. It means you feel it and you stay seaworthy. It means you take the hit below the waterline, the false accusation, the 7 years of quiet, the serving tray, the temp work, the she's a little lost and you don't sink. Not because you're made of something harder than other people, but because you know what you're for. Because the mission is larger than the damage. I know what I'm for. I have always known. And I think on the mornings when I am most tired and the file on my desk is the heaviest and the coffee has gone cold before I could drink it, I think that knowing is the thing that matters most. More than rank. More than recognition. More than any room's revised opinion of who you are. You know what you've done. You know who came home because you didn't stop. You know the weight of what you carried, and you know you carried it well. That's the ironclad. That's all it ever was. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Whatever you've been carrying quietly, whatever room has been telling you a story about yourself that isn't the full truth, whatever version of you has been waiting to be named accurately, you know what you're for. And if there's someone in your life who's been carrying something alone, maybe this is the moment to let them know you see them. Drop a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. I'll be here.